that nothing wrote his book. And because the world wanted to believe his very plausible for origins that didn't involve God, the first edition of his book sold out the day it was released. So the world was really looking for some answer that didn't include God. And his ideas really got off the ground because of the wicked heart that really is in man. It's a spiritual problem. People do not want a God there, because if the God is there, then to him we are accountable, and people don't want that. And that's why Darwin's ideas got off the ground so readily, and tragically they were supported by a lot of clergy at the time. But the hard evidence, what it does, it really supports the Bible's account of history and not the world's account. But Christians, we really need to be very, very clear on what the Bible actually does say. And it says that in the beginning, God created. And it also tells us how long he took to do that creation. It tells us that he took 6 days over creation, and days really have to be 6 24-hour days. And it amazes me that Bible-believing Christians would actually dispute that they were anything but 24-hour days. Because when we look at Exodus 20, when God gives the commandments to the children of Israel and to Moses, he actually says that in 6 days he made the heavens and the earth, and the seventh to be a day of rest. That's how God gave them the Sabbath. But if you put yourself in the position of those Israelites at the time, there were more than 1 million of them, and they were camped around Mount Sinai, which was a mountain that was smoking like a volcano and rumbling like an earthquake, and they were terrified. And never ever in history have 1 million people heard the voice of God actually saying, in 6 days I made the heavens and the earth. Now, if you're a Bible believer, how could you possibly argue with that? I mean, that was the voice of God done in the hearing of 1 million people. It's interesting also that God says that from the beginning he made them male and female. He didn't say you can choose which gender you want to be. He said, I made you male or female. There's no way that you've got the option of choosing which one you want to be. If we then to ask, when did that creation take place, those 6 days of creation, the Bible, again, is pretty clear. We can get the idea of how old the earth is from the book of Genesis for a start, because we read in 5 that Adam was 130 when he had his son Seth, and Seth was 105 when he had Enosh, and so on. And you can add up all of those years from Adam down to Noah at the time of the flood, and you get 1,656 years from Adam to Noah. And you can read a bit further and you can see from Noah to Abraham is about 350. So that means from Adam to Abraham is about 2,000 years. You can then look a bit further and you can see that from Abraham to the time of Jesus is about another 2,000, and from Jesus to us today is another 2,000. When you put them all together, you get 6,000 years of history according to the Bible. Now, you don't get billions and billions of years. You get about 6,000. And an interesting point when you look at those names up there, have a look. We've got Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, and Jared. When we go to the New Testament, when we go to Luke chapter 3, Luke gives Jesus' genealogy, and he takes him all the way back through Noah to Adam, who was the Son of God. And when you have a look at the sequence in Luke, you see Adam, Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared. Exactly the same sequence as you see in Genesis. So the New Testament and the Old Testament are in complete agreement with that genealogy. So there's no way from the Bible that you can get anything but about 6,000 years of earth history. And explaining the evidence is really what we do at Creation Ministries. And we do it in a number of ways. We do speaking engagements like this, particularly in churches. We do radio programs, regular Tuesday morning radio program on my local Rema radio. Pastor Sam mentioned Creation Magazine, and we're going to talk a bit about that at the end. And we have a website, creation.com. If you have any questions at all in this area, all you need to do is to go to the website and there's a search window. And if you put all your questions into any of your questions into that search window, you'll come up with the answers that you've asked. We also people to give us their email address. And we have a little form that I'm going to mention again at the end. On one side it says, did you know? And it's got a question about creation on that. But on the other side, there's a place for your name, your postcode and your email address. And we'd really love everybody to fill those in so that we can notify you of things that are happening in the area. Your postcode is important because we can tell you by postcode what's going on. But also we send out these regular emails. And if ever there's a major announcement in the secular press, Creation Ministries tries to give a biblically based response to it fairly quickly, and we do it by email. So I'll remind you again about that at the beginning, but we'd love to have you fill in your email address for us. That's what it looks like. And, I want to talk now about how things really got to be the way they are in the world, because it wasn't always so. If we go back only a couple of centuries, most of Europe, for example, believed what the Bible said. There was a famous guy called Archbishop Usher. He was an archbishop in Ireland, and he did the most incredible research that you probably could do today with the aid of Google, but he didn't have Google. And he did amazing research in this book called The End of the World. And he came up with a date of creation of about 4004 BC. Well, whether it's exactly that or not, I'm not sure, but it's certainly got to be pretty close. If you think about most of the early great scientists like Isaac Newton, they were Bible believers. Isaac Newton is regarded as probably the greatest scientist who ever lived, and he was a Bible-believing Christian. He actually wrote more about the Bible than he did about science. He was a very, very strong believer. And the Bible's history of origins was the prevailing view in Western society. Fossils were known at the time, and they were believed to have come from Noah's flood. All changed with the advent of Darwin. But even the Encyclopedia Britannica spoke about Noah's flood. Now, this is what it said. It said under the heading "Deluge," the most memorable was that called the Universal Deluge or Noah's flood, which overflowed and destroyed the whole earth, and out of which only Noah and those with him in the ark escaped. Well, that's exactly what the Bible says, isn't it? Well, you might be surprised that the Encyclopedia Britannica would say that, and of course it doesn't anymore, but it did then in its first edition in 1771. So that's only 250 years ago, about the time that Captain Cook was sailing up the east coast of Australia. So it's not all that long ago that the Encyclopedia Britannica believed things like that. But all things began to change a bit after that. There was a Scottish guy called James Hutton, and he had been influenced by the French, particularly people like Voltaire, and he didn't believe the biblical time frame. And he went to this very famous place now called Sycamore Point in Scotland, and he decided that the rocks looked very old. Now, you can't tell the age of a rock just by looking at it, but that's what he decided. And he was followed by another fellow called Charles Lyell, who wrote a book called Principles of Geology. These guys are probably what we call the earliest geologists. Lyell decided that he did not want people to believe the Bible, and he was determined to undermine the chronology that was in it. That was his stated intent when he wrote the book. And unfortunately, he had great influence on another person, and that person was the young Charles Darwin. Because Darwin, when he went on the voyage around the world that everybody's heard about, he was only 22. He was only a very, very young man. And he took a copy of that bloke Lyell's book with him, and that's what gave him the idea of young ages, an old earth. And he was able to make his own observations and put them in the framework of that old earth and come up with his theory of evolution. And as I said to you before, he was aided and abetted by clergy, and people really wanted to believe when his book came out that there was an explanation for origins that didn't include God. He had huge influence in both Europe and in North America. And in North America, probably he had the greatest influence on this guy, a bloke called Othniel Marsh, who was a great fossil hunter and assembled a series of, most of his fossils ended up in the museum at Yale. And what Marsh did was he decided that the horse had evolved, and he produced this museum display of a whole series of skeletons in ascending order of size, and he said, this is how the horse has evolved. And that was accepted unquestioningly by people at the time. That sequence got into the textbooks. I know that I read it myself and I believed it. I thought it was wonderful, but there isn't any evidence for it. And even these little skeletons, everybody knows that they're not horses. And nobody would ever defend that display that appeared in the museums, but it appeared in textbooks for at least 100 years afterwards. And when you think about it, if you see a set of diagrams in a textbook like that, telling you how the horse evolved, if you were a young student and you didn't have any background knowledge of what we talk about here, you would believe that, because there it is in a textbook, and you think, well, the textbooks must be true. You automatically think that their contents are factual. And I know that I did. I was going through university. I believed all of that because I thought, well, it makes sense, and the textbooks obviously are going to be telling the truth. There's not going to be anything in them that is not true. Another thing that I was taught in my medical course, and you might have seen diagrams like this before in biology textbooks, and these were diagrams put out by a German embryologist by the name of Ernst Haeckel. And he decided that all developing embryos at development look very much the same. And he produced these diagrams to show that they all look very, very similar. And again, those diagrams got in the textbooks, and they were there for 100 years or more, and people believed that we all go through this evolutionary fish stage. And because they're in the textbooks, people believe them. But some years ago, a British embryologist by the name of Michael Richardson tried to Haeckel's experiments, and he developed all of these embryos and he took photos of them, and the photographs don't look anything like the original drawings. And he realised that the drawings had been faked. They were simply not true. And he had this to say in the London Times. He said, this is one of the worst cases of scientific fraud. He said, it's shocking that somebody that you thought was a great scientist was deliberately misleading. He said what he did was to take a human embryo and copy it and pretend that all the others look the same at the same stage of development, because they don't. But you see, those two things, the evolution of the horse and all of these embryos, they appeared in the textbooks for hundreds of years, and everybody who did biological science courses was taught them. And students are still being taught these things about evolution, even though for at least 50 years, these diagrams of Haeckel's have been known to be false. This was on the biology paper in the New South Wales HSC only a few years ago, and you see that they said the diagram shows different embryos at the same stage of development. How do they provide evidence for evolution? And here we find on the exam paper those same diagrams that have been discredited for at least 50 years, but here they are still being taught in high schools. And the answer they're looking for, of course, is C, that they have structures that look similar. But it's been disproven for 50 years, and yet there it is still on HSC papers in New South Wales. I did some talks in a place called Cowra a year or two ago, and I was taken to a museum in another town called Canowindra out there in New South Wales, and they have this museum they call the Age of Fishes Museum, because in a roadway near there they dug up a whole lot of these fossil fish. And that museum is a very popular place for school excursions. And I went into the classroom there where the kids sit down and they get taught. And there on the wall was this diagram of those embryos. This is only 2 years ago, still being taught, right, to children, because it explains evolution to them, even though it's nonsense, and it's been known to be nonsense for at least 50 years. So this is the sort of thing that you're up against if you are a parent. Your children will be going on excursions to places like that. There was another story that used to appear in the biology textbooks, and you may be familiar with this one. This is the story about the peppered moth. And the way the story goes, there's this moth in England that comes in two forms, a light form and a dark form. Got the idea that the percentage of the light forms and dark forms had changed over time, because with the Industrial Revolution and all the soot coming out of the chimneys, then the trees got blackened, and so he decided light-coloured forms of the moth could be more easily spotted on the trees by the birds, and so they would eat them up, and so there would be more of the dark-coloured ones because they were better hidden. And again, that got into all the textbooks. And I read that myself, and I believed it. I thought it was a great. The only problem was that about the truth came out. And when you think about it, it should have been twigged to earlier, because moths are flying around at night, and birds are not going out looking for moths at night. Predominantly, they do it during the day. So how come they got these photos and the film showing birds eating up the moths? Well, it turned out that the photos were all staged. They were dead moths glued onto appropriately coloured pieces of tree bark and photographed. And the video were laboratory-bred moths taken out in the forest, shoveled onto trees, and the birds came down and had a picnic. So it was all fake science. But again, that was in the textbooks, and it was there for about 50 years or so. You don't find it there so much now. But these are the sort of things that got evolution off the ground. And there are plenty of other frauds and deceptions like this. It does not have the evidence for it that you are led to believe is there. When you look at the evidence that there is, it is all very, very supportive of biblical creation. So that's just a bit of a potted history of how evolution really got the grip on society that it has today, but because man does not want to believe in a creator God to whom he is accountable. I want to give you one real scientific example of how impossible any idea of evolution really is. And the best example I know is the example of DNA. Now, we've all heard about DNA, but we don't necessarily know. And so I'm going to just show you now the diagram of DNA and explain it a bit. This is a little bit technical, but it's very helpful for you to understand it, particularly in this day and age when you're hearing about DNA vaccines and RNA vaccines and so on. It does help to understand what these things are. This is the diagram of DNA that you often see in a biology textbook. It's a bit like a twisted ladder. It's got a double helical structure. Imagine it a bit like a twisted ladder. And what it is, it has the sides of the ladder are made of a sugar phosphate compound, and the rungs of the ladder are these 4 nucleotide bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And to show that they are a code or a program, we usually give them their first letter because it's easier to see that they're a code if we say A, T, C, and G. So that's the real take-home message of DNA, that it is a software program. DNA stands for deoxyribose nucleic acid because the sugar is deoxyribose and the rungs are these nucleic acids. So A, T, G, and C. They're organic chemical compounds. They are amazing in the code that they form. If you line it up like you see on that slide, you can see that it forms a code or a program. And it is the most amazingly sophisticated program that the world has ever seen. If you think about your human body, your body is your hardware. What develops the hardware and what runs the hardware is the software, and that is DNA. And it's there right from the beginning. If you take a seed that's got DNA inside it, and that DNA program shows the seed how to germinate and grow and then builds the tree or whatever it happens to be. If you take a fertilized egg, that egg has a DNA program in it that enables the chicken to develop, and then that DNA supports it growing into the chook and so on. From a human point of view, if we have a fertilized egg, right from the beginning, we have that program in the fertilized egg that then grows us, develops us, and maintains us. All we need to do is add fuel so that the program can continue. And it really is remarkable stuff. Where do we find it? If we think of a biological cell, and this is a diagram of a cell, most of our DNA is in that little area of the cell that we call our nucleus. And it's packaged in a whole lot of folders that we call chromosomes. And we've got 23 pairs of them. And we find them in the nucleus of the cell, and they match up. We've got one of each pair from our mother and one of each pair from our father. And they're matching pairs, except for one pair chromosome 23 that we call X and Y. If you've got two X's, that is very matching pairs, you're female. If you've got an X and a Y, then you are male. We've got these 23 pairs of chromosomes in our, and they are made of DNA. And the next slide is taking one of those pairs out and unraveling it. And here it is, that chromosome. And if you unraveled it, it's a bit like unraveling a skein of wool. And what you have is this great long string of DNA. And a segment of that DNA is what we call a gene. So if you've got blue eyes or brown eyes, you've got a stretch of that DNA program that codes for blue eyes or brown hair or blonde hair or whatever. You know, all our characteristics are coded on that DNA. And just to give you an idea of how much of the program we have, is a guy called Craig Venter. Now, between the years 1990 and 2003, there was a project in the US called the Human Genome Project. That was to map a human DNA program for the first time ever. And this guy, Craig Venter, headed up the private project that was sorting out all this DNA. And he was the first person on Earth to actually have his entire genome printed out, every letter of his DNA. And here he is standing in front of his printout. Right? It is an absolute library. There were in total, that's not focused terribly well, is it? I'm sorry about that, but there you go. There were 175 volumes. Each volume had 750 A4 sheets. Each of the A4 sheets was printed on both sides in Times New Roman 8 point with narrow margins, so a pretty small font. And in total, there were 131,000 A4 sheets, 262,000 A4 pages. And this is what the printout actually looked like. That's a page, and that's a close-up. 262,000 pages of a program that works, a software program, and yet, if you are an evolution believer, then what you are believing is that that program wrote itself by trial and error over millions and billions of years. I mean, common sense tells you that is just not possible. Even the simplest software program requires an intelligent programmer. And this is the most sophisticated program imaginable. I've got a quote here from a guy called Paul Davies, who is a professor at Macquarie Uni, and this is what he said. He said, "Nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software?" I mean, common sense tells you that they can't. I've got another quote here from a guy from the Garvan Institute in Sydney. "There's always something new being discovered about DNA." And they discovered something a couple of years ago that was new. What it was isn't important, but what he said about how much they know about DNA is very instructive. This is the guy, Marcel Dinger, and he said this. He said, "We don't know the function of 98% of the genome." He said, "This is a new code that's going to help us understand the bits that we don't understand." So by his own admission, even the experts in the field only understand 2% of that sort of thing that you saw there with Craig Venter. 98% we still don't know, and yet they believe that it is written by trial and error over millions and billions of years. I mean, if you ever wanted any proof that that they can accept it, but they don't want to concede the possibility of an almighty creator God, the only credible alternative. And what that means, of course, is that Adam and Eve were truly the first two people, and they were created by God. Now, Richard Dawkins, who I'm sure you've heard of, he didn't want to believe that. Richard said this. He said, the original sin is supposed to have been committed by Adam, who, as Richard believes, we now know never existed. So now we've got the preposterous idea that Jesus was sacrificed for the sin of a non-existent forebear. And I've got another quote from this guy, an atheist who said this in a debate with a Christian. He spells it out even more. He said, his name's Frank Zindler. He said, the most devastating thing that biology did to Christianity was the discovery of biological evolution. He said, now that we know that Adam and Eve never were real people, this is his belief, right? The central myth of Christianity is destroyed. He said, if there never was an Adam and an Eve, there never was an original sin. If there never was original sin, there's no need of salvation. So if there's no need of salvation, we don't need a saviour. So that puts Jesus into the ranks of the unemployed. So he said, I think that evolution is absolutely the death knell of Christianity. Well, that's what Richard Dawkins and his atheistic mates believe. But what's actually the truth? Science knows about a woman that they call mitochondrial Eve. Now, it's well known that there is a small amount of DNA in cellular structures called mitochondria. And we only get our mitochondrial DNA from mothers. Fathers don't pass it on because it's part of, not in the nucleus, it's in the rest of the cell. And these mitochondria are other structures in the cell, and it's known that every person on the face of the earth can trace their mitochondrial DNA back to one woman. And they call her, for obvious reasons, jokingly, mitochondrial Eve. But they've also done some studies on male Y chromosomes. And what they find is that every man can trace his Y chromosome back to one original man, who they call, secularly, Y chromosome Adam. So here we have science demonstrating that we all trace back to one woman and all men trace back to one man. What did Adam say to Eve when he called his name Eve? He said, you are going to be the mother of all. What do we find? We find that there is one woman in everybody's history, right? One woman. We all trace back to one woman. And it actually gets even better than that, because with the mitochondrial DNA, it's known that there are three very slightly different strands of that mitochondrial DNA, all funneling back to one, consistent with the three women in the ark who were the wives of Noah's sons. Noah's sons all had the same Y chromosome. They got that from their father, and that's why that traces back to Adam. But we have three slightly different strands of mitochondrial DNA tracing back to one original woman. So what we find is absolutely consistent with what the Bible tells us, even though science does not want to accept it. We all actually do come from one man and one woman. So Richard Dawkins and Frank Zindler are not correct in saying that Adam and Eve have been disproven. They haven't. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just go on to explain a couple of things about the materials that we've got. That's our website, creation.com. If you have any questions, all you need to do is type them into the search window. We have many articles, 12,000 or more articles on that website, all free, papers written by experts in the field, but all written at a level that anybody can understand. So you can check up anything, whether it's scientific or theological, on that website. I mentioned our little slips for your email address. We would really love you to fill this in and give us your email address so that we can keep you informed about various things that are happening, and particularly with your postcode, we can let you know if there's something happening in your area. So please consider filling out one of those forms. These are free, and so is the website, absolutely free. What's not free, but hang on, that didn't move. Something's happened. They're not. It's not changing. Okay, what's not free, but we would say it's priceless, is Creation Magazine. And Pastor Sam mentioned this at the beginning, encouraging everybody to subscribe to this magazine. It comes out 4 times a year. It really is amazing. I often hear from people in Christian ministries, particularly those who have children, how valuable this was in the upbringing of their children so that they can convince them about the truth of what the Bible says about Genesis. For myself, I came from a background where I was an evolution-believing atheist as I went through my medical course, and only became a Christian later in life. But this magazine has been fantastic for me because it began in 1978, very shortly after I became a Christian. I heard about it. I've been subscribing to that magazine since issue number 1 back in 1978. So I've been getting it for 42 years now, and I have read every article. I've read every issue from cover to cover and every article, and I can tell you it has been a huge blessing to me. And now I get to be a speaker for the ministry, and to me that really is just fantastic. You can take out a subscription to the magazine, either a 1-year or a 3-year. A 1-year costs $32, a 3-year is $85. If you take out a 3-year subscription, we also give you a $15 voucher so that you can spend that on anything else at the table. So think about the magazine. If you've got children in the home, you can't afford to be without it. I don't believe Christian people in this day and age can afford to be without it anyway, because it is so faith-building. We all go through times when our faith gets a bit rocky and we're not sure that we can really trust the Word of God as it's written. But I can tell you, when you read the articles in that magazine, it really will encourage your faith and show you that the Word of God is absolutely true. There are also some books and DVDs down there. You can have a look at them as well. There's one called the Answers book, the answers to most of the questions that speakers commonly get asked. So have a look at that afterwards and invest in those books. Remember that 50 years ago, none of this sort of material was available. Now it is, and it's worthwhile Christian people availing themselves of it. Okay, well, look, I'm going to stop there and hand back to Naji and dismiss those who want to be dismissed, Naji, or whatever you wish to do. But thank you for listening. For those who want to stay and ask some questions, by all means, come up to the front and we're going to have a Q&A session. So over to you for the moment, Naji.